The last three dragons were dying in Lyra's arms, and she did not know how to save them. She stood on the observation deck of her small ship and watched the blue planet grow larger through the window, while her heart pounded with fear and desperate hope. The dragons made soft whimpering sounds that broke her soul into smaller pieces with each breath. They were so tiny and fragile now when they should have been growing strong and fierce. The copper one had stopped eating 2 days ago, and its scales had lost their bright shine. The silver dragon could barely lift its head anymore and just pressed against her chest, seeking warmth. The green one still had some fight left, but even that spirit was fading like morning mist under a cruel sun. Lyra had watched 17 dragons disappear over the past 3 months, and each loss felt like losing part of herself. Her people did not just keep dragons as pets because the bond went deeper than that and stretched back thousands of years to when elves first walked among the stars. Dragons were partners and friends and family, all wrapped together in scales and fire and loyalty that never wavered. But something was killing them, and nobody could figure out what. The adult dragons vanished first when they went hunting in the valleys and forests of their homeworld. Search parties found nothing except empty caves and the faint smell of ozone that made instruments flicker and die. Then the younger dragons started getting sick and losing their color, and refusing to eat. Healers tried every remedy in their ancient books and consulted with wise ones from distant worlds, but nothing worked. The dragons just kept fading away like stars going dark, one by one. Lyra's bondmate had been among the first to disappear, and that loss nearly destroyed her. His name was Ember, and his scales had shone like polished rubies in sunlight. They had flown together through nebulas and danced on solar winds and shared thoughts in the way that only bonded pairs could understand. When he vanished, she felt the connection snap like a broken string, and the silence that followed was worse than any scream. She had these 3 babies because Ember had been teaching them to hunt before he disappeared. They imprinted on her in their grief and confusion, and she could not abandon them, even though her own people were preparing to evacuate their dying world. The Elven Council met for 7 days and nights trying to understand what was happening. Scientists brought data and theories, while mystics spoke of ancient curses and disrupted energy flows. Nobody agreed on anything except that their world had become poisonous to dragons somehow. Some elves wanted to flee to the core worlds where their ancient cities still stood proud and tall. Others argued for settling new frontier planets far from whatever corruption had infected their home. Lyra did not care about politics or grand plans because she only cared about saving these 3 small lives that depended on her. She had heard rumors in the trading posts and whispered stories from travelers who moved between worlds. They spoke of humans and their strange effect on other species. The stories seemed too wild to believe at first because they talked about how human presence could stabilize alien biology and heal wounds that should have been fatal. Some traders claimed that animals near human settlements grew stronger and healthier than their wild cousins. Others whispered about how humans radiated, something that affected the energy fields of living things around them. Lyra dismissed these tales as superstition until she met an old merchant from the Krell Consortium. His name was Vex, and he had 3 eyes that saw in different spectrums, and he never lied about matters of commerce. Vex told her about a human frontier settlement on a planet called Haven's Edge, where strange things happened to the creatures that lived nearby. He said that dying animals recovered when humans touched them, and that sick plants bloomed when placed in human gardens. Vex did not understand why this happened, but he swore on his family name that he had seen it with his own eyes. Lyra had nothing left to lose, and these 3 dragons had even less. She filed a flight plan and ignored the protests from the council who wanted her to stay and help with the evacuation. Her ship was small and fast and designed for long-range exploration rather than comfort. She pushed the engines hard and traveled through hyperspace lanes that most pilots avoided because they were unstable and dangerous. The copper dragon grew weaker during the journey and stopped responding to her mental calls. She held it against her skin and tried to share her own life energy, but it was like pouring water into sand. The silver one developed a rattling sound in its breathing that terrified her, because she had heard that sound before in dragons that were hours from death. Only the green dragon maintained any strength, and it used that strength to curl protectively around its siblings. Lyra did not sleep much during the 5-day journey because she was too afraid that if she closed her eyes, The dragons would slip away while she dreamed. She sang to them in the old language and told them stories about Ember and promised them that help was coming. She did not know if she was lying or telling the truth. Haven's edge appeared on her sensors as a small orange dot that grew into a proper planet with swirling white clouds and vast oceans. The human settlement was marked on her navigation charts as a minor outpost with a population of less than 500 people. It sat on a coastal plateau, where the land met the sea in dramatic cliffs that reminded her of home. Lyra sent the standard approach codes and waited for permission to land while her hands shook on the controls. Human voice answered in clear standard language and granted her landing clearance without asking many questions. That surprised her, because most settlements were suspicious of unknown ships. Maybe humans were different, or maybe they were just careless. She did not care which, as long as they could help. The landing pad was simple and functional, with none of the artistic touches that elves would have added. Structures made from prefabricated materials clustered together like boxes stacked by someone in a hurry. Everything looked temporary and rough, as if the humans had not decided whether to stay or leave. Lyra gathered the 3 dragons carefully and wrapped them in a thermal blanket that did almost nothing to help anymore. She took a deep breath and opened the airlock and stepped out into the bright sunlight of an alien world. The air smelled different here, with salt from the ocean, and something else that she could not identify. It felt heavier than the air on her home world, and pressed against her skin in a way that was not entirely unpleasant. Several humans had gathered near the landing pad, and they watched her with open curiosity. They were shorter than elves and built more solidly, with broader shoulders and thicker limbs. Their faces showed a range of emotions that flickered past too quickly for her to read. One young woman stepped forward with a friendly expression and bright eyes that reminded Lyra of a hunting bird. She had dark hair pulled back in a simple tail and wore clothes that were practical and covered in dust. The woman spoke, and the translator on Lyra's belt converted the words into something she could understand. She was asking if Lyra needed help. Lyra wanted to answer, but her voice caught in her throat because the copper dragon chose that exact moment to let out a weak cry that sounded like breaking glass. The sound cut through the air and made every human present freeze and look. The young woman's expression changed instantly from curiosity to concern. She stepped closer without fear or hesitation and reached out one hand toward the bundle Lyra carried. Lyra knew this was the moment that would decide everything. She could protect the dragons and watch them die slowly, or she could trust these strange aliens with the last precious lives she had left to protect. The choice was not really a choice at all. She pulled back the thermal blanket and let the woman see the 3 dying dragons who represented everything Lyra had left in the universe. The human woman reached out and touched the copper dragon with gentle fingers, and something impossible happened right before Lyra's eyes. The dragon's scales brightened, like someone had lit a candle inside its body, and it lifted its head for the first time in days. The change was instant and undeniable, and completely beyond anything Lyra had expected. The copper dragon made a sound that was half chirp and half purr, and pushed its small head against the woman's palm. Lyra felt the bond flare, back to life in her mind like a dying ember suddenly catching fire again. The woman looked startled, but she did not pull her hand away and instead moved her fingers carefully along the dragon's neck. Every place she touched seemed to glow brighter, and the dragon's breathing became stronger and more regular. The other 2 dragons noticed immediately and began squirming in Lyra's arms, trying to reach the human. The silver one found enough strength to crawl across Lyra's shoulder, and the green one actually spread its tiny wings in excitement. The human woman laughed, and the sound was warm and full of genuine delight rather than fear. She called out something in her own language, and another human came running from one of the nearby buildings. This one was older, with gray streaks in his dark hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent outdoors. He stopped short when he saw the dragons, and his expression shifted through several emotions before settling on understanding. The woman spoke rapidly to him while keeping one hand on the copper dragon and gesturing with the other. The older man nodded and replied in a calm voice, and then turned to Lyra with a kind smile. His translator was better than the woman's, and his words came through clearly. He introduced himself as Ben, and explained that the young woman was named Katie. Ben said they had seen this kind of thing before with other alien creatures that came near the human settlement. He did not fully understand why it happened, but he knew that human contact seemed to help stabilize certain types of biology. Lyra found her voice finally and asked if they could help the dragons. Her words came out shaky and desperate, and she did not care because pride meant nothing compared to 3 small lives. Ben assured her that they would do everything possible and gestured toward the settlement buildings. Katie was already walking in that direction with the copper dragon cradled against her chest, and the little creature looked more alive than it had in weeks. Lyra followed with the other 2 dragons and felt hope blooming in her chest like a flower after long winter. The settlement was basic and functional with none of the flowing architecture that elves preferred. Everything was built from standard colonial materials with straight lines and simple designs, but it was clean and well maintained, and the humans who stopped to stare at them seemed curious rather than hostile. Ben led them to a building marked with symbols that Lyra's translator identified as medical facility. The door opened automatically and cool air rushed out carrying the smell of antiseptics and something else that was distinctly human. Inside was a large room filled with equipment that looked both familiar and strange. Some devices Lyra recognized from elven medical centers, while others were clearly human innovations. A woman in a white coat looked up from a console, and her eyes went wide when she saw the dragons. Ben spoke quickly to her, and she immediately cleared a large examination table and gestured for them to bring the dragons closer. Her name was Lisa, and she was the settlement's chief medical officer. She had steady hands and a calm manner that reminded Lyra of the best healers on her homeworld. Lisa examined each dragon carefully using scanners that hummed softly and displayed information on floating screens. She asked Lyra questions about symptoms and timeline, and what treatments had already been attempted. Lyra answered as completely as she could while watching Katie continue to hold the copper dragon. The creature had not left her arms and seemed content to stay pressed against her skin. The silver dragon kept reaching toward Ben with plaintive sounds until he finally picked it up the moment it made contact with his skin. The same brightening effect occurred and the dragon relaxed visibly. The green one was the strongest of the 3, and it explored the examination table with growing curiosity. When Lisa reached out to steady it, the dragon immediately pressed against her hand and its scales took on a deeper, richer color. Lisa studied her scanner readings with a frown of concentration and then looked up at Lyra with serious eyes. She explained that the dragons were suffering from some kind of energy depletion that was affecting their cellular function. Their bodies were not processing nutrients correctly, and their natural growth patterns had been severely disrupted. Without intervention, they would continue to fade until their systems simply shut down. But Lisa also said that proximity to humans seemed to be counteracting whatever was causing the depletion. The readings showed that the dragon's energy levels were stabilizing and their cellular function was improving. She could not explain the mechanism, but the effect was measurable and real. Lyra felt tears sliding down her face, and she did not try to stop them. She had been so afraid for so long and carried the weight of 17 lost dragons and Ember's disappearance. To finally have hope was almost more painful than the fear had been. Katie noticed Lyra's tears and said something gentle that the translator did not quite catch, but the tone was clear enough, and Lyra understood that these humans meant to help. Ben suggested that Lyra should rest while they continued monitoring the dragons. He showed her to a small room with a bed and basic facilities, and told her to take whatever time she needed. Lyra did not want to leave the dragons, but exhaustion was pulling at her like a heavy tide. She lay down on the bed, which was softer than elven sleeping platforms, and closed her eyes just for a moment. She woke 6 hours later in a panic because she had not meant to sleep. That long Lyra rushed back to the medical facility expecting the worst. Instead, she found all 3 dragons alert and active and making happy sounds. Katie was sitting on the floor playing with the copper dragon using a piece of cloth tied to a string. Dragon was pouncing and flapping its wings and showing more energy than Lyra had seen in months. Ben had the silver dragon perched on his shoulder while he worked at a console. The dragon was watching the screen with interest and occasionally making small sounds as if commenting on Ben's work. Lisa had the green dragon helping her organize medical supplies by pointing at different containers. The dragon seemed to understand what she wanted, and was clearly enjoying the game. Lyra stood in the doorway and tried to process what she was seeing. These humans had not just stabilized the dragons, but had somehow formed bonds with them in a matter of hours. Katie looked up and smiled and said something about the copper dragon being very playful. Ben turned and explained that they had been monitoring the dragons continuously, and all vital signs were improving steadily. Lisa added that she wanted to keep them under observation for at least a few more days, but she was optimistic about their recovery. Lyra asked the question that had been burning in her mind since she landed. She wanted to know why humans had this effect, and whether it would last. Lisa admitted that nobody fully understood the mechanism. Human biology produced certain energy fields and chemical signatures that seemed to interact with other species in beneficial ways. The effect was stronger with younger or weakened creatures and required relatively close proximity. Some scientists theorized that humans carried genetic markers from an ancient species that had once seeded life across multiple star systems. Others believed it was simply a quirk of how human metabolism operated at higher temperatures and faster rates than most other sentient species. Whatever the cause, the effect was real and consistent. Lyra asked if the dragons could stay near humans long enough to fully recover. Ben and Lisa exchanged glances, and then Ben said they would need to speak with the settlement administrator, but his tone suggested that he thought it would not be a problem. Katie stood up with the copper dragon still clinging to her shirt and declared that she would personally argue for letting them stay. The dragon chirped in apparent agreement, and Lyra felt something crack open in her chest. It was not just gratitude, although she felt plenty of that. It was something bigger and more profound. These humans had not hesitated to help, even though Lyra was a stranger from a species they barely knew. They had not demanded payment or asked for favors. In return, they had simply seen creatures in need and responded with kindness. Lyra realized that she had judged humans based on rumors and assumptions. The stories made them sound chaotic and dangerous and unpredictable. But standing here watching Katie play with a dragon and Ben work with another perched on his shoulder, she saw something different. She saw people who were capable of great gentleness and who formed connections easily and naturally. Maybe that was the real human gift. The settlement administrator was a tall woman named Claire, who had sharp eyes and a way of listening that made Lyra feel actually heard. They met in a simple office with windows overlooking the ocean, where waves crashed against dark rocks far below. Claire sat behind a desk made from local wood and gestured for Lyra to take the chair across from her. Ben and Lisa stood nearby, and Katie had come along with the copper dragon still wrapped around her shoulders. The little dragon watched everything with bright, curious eyes and made soft trilling sounds whenever Katie moved. Claire listened without interrupting, while Lyra explained everything that had happened to her people and the dragons. She described the disappearances and the sickness and the desperate journey across star systems to find help. Lyra showed her data recordings from the elven healers and explained how nothing had worked until human contact. Claire studied the information carefully and asked questions that showed she understood the complexity of the situation. When Lyra finished speaking, Claire leaned back in her chair and was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that surprised everyone in the room. She said that Lyra and the dragons could stay as long as they needed, and that the settlement would provide whatever support was possible. But Claire also said that she wanted something in return. She wanted to understand why this was happening and whether other dragons and elves were at risk. Claire proposed that Lyra work with the human scientists to study the phenomenon and share information with the Elven Council. If they could figure out what was causing the dragon deaths, then maybe they could prevent more losses. Lyra agreed immediately because it was more than fair, and because she wanted answers just as badly as Claire did. Claire assigned living quarters for Lyra in one of the residential buildings and set up a schedule for the dragons to spend time with different humans. The goal was to maintain the stabilizing effect while gathering data about how it worked. Katie volunteered to be primary caretaker for the copper dragon, and her enthusiasm was impossible to miss. Ben offered to take responsibility for the silver one and said he could keep it with him in the engineering workshops. Lisa claimed the green dragon for the medical facility and already had ideas about how its presence might help with other patients. Over the next few days, Lyra watched her dragons transform, from dying creatures into healthy, vibrant younglings. The copper dragon followed Katie everywhere and learned to play fetch with small objects. It started attempting short flights across the residential common area and managed to stay airborne for several seconds before landing clumsily. Katie cheered every attempt, and the dragon clearly loved the attention. The silver dragon became Ben's constant companion in the workshops where he maintained settlement equipment. It watched him work with intense focus and sometimes tried to help by holding tools in its small claws. Ben claimed the dragon was bringing him good luck, because several problems that had plagued him for weeks suddenly resolved themselves. The green dragon thrived in the medical facility and seemed genuinely interested in what Lisa was doing. It learned to recognize different instruments and would fetch specific items when Lisa pointed at them. Other humans started visiting just to see the helpful dragon, and it clearly enjoyed being the center of attention. Lyra spent her days working with a team of human scientists who specialized in xenobiology and energy field research. A woman named Rachel led the team, and she approached the mystery with enthusiasm and careful methodology. They ran tests on the dragons and on Lyra herself, and compared data with information from other alien species who had reported similar effects. The research revealed fascinating patterns that nobody had fully documented before. Human bodies generated bioelectric fields that were stronger and more stable than those of most other sentient species. These fields seemed to interact with the natural energy systems of creatures who were weakened or young. The effect was something like a resonance where human energy helped stabilize disrupted patterns in other organisms. But the research also revealed something troubling. Rachel's team detected traces of the same strange energy signature that had been found near the disappearance sites on Lyra's homeworld. The signature showed up as background noise in Haven's Edge atmosphere, but at levels far too low to cause harm. This suggested that whatever was affecting the dragons might not be limited to one world. Lyra sent regular reports back to the Elven Council, and their responses grew increasingly alarmed. More dragons were disappearing across multiple Elven colonies, and the pattern was spreading. The Council wanted to know if human contact could help on a larger scale. Claire called a town meeting to discuss the situation, and nearly everyone in the settlement attended. The humans gathered in the main assembly hall and listened while Claire explained what was happening to the elves and dragons. She asked whether the settlement would be willing to accept more refugees if they came seeking help. The response was not unanimous because some humans worried about resources and whether they could support a larger population, but the majority voted to open the settlement to elves and dragons in need. Katie spoke passionately about how the dragons had already enriched the settlement and brought wonder back to daily life. Ben argued that helping the elves could lead to valuable cultural and technological exchange. Lisa pointed out that studying the phenomenon would advance human understanding of xenobiology. The vote passed with a solid majority, and Claire immediately sent word to the Elven Council. Within a week, 3 more ships arrived carrying elves with sick dragons. Then, 5 more came, and then a dozen. The settlement expanded rapidly as humans and elves worked together to build new structures and establish protocols. Katie organized a volunteer program where humans spent time each day with dragons who needed stabilization. The program became wildly popular because most humans found the dragons fascinating and adorable. Ben's workshop started producing specialized equipment designed jointly by human and elven engineers. The collaboration sparked innovations that neither species would have developed alone. Lisa's medical facility became a center for xenobiological research, where scientists from both species shared knowledge freely. They discovered that the mysterious energy signature was coming from subspace radiation that affected dragon biology specifically. The radiation disrupted the natural energy patterns that dragons used for everything from digestion to flight. Most species were unaffected, but dragons were particularly vulnerable because of how their bodies processed energy. Human bioelectric fields created a kind of shield that blocked the radiation and allowed dragon biology to function normally. The discovery was breakthrough, but it also raised new questions. Where was the radiation coming from, and why was it spreading? Rachel's team theorized that it might be related to increased subspace travel as more species expanded into new regions of space. Every ship that jumped through hyperspace created ripples in subspace that normally dissipated. quickly. But if enough ships were traveling through the same regions, the ripples might accumulate into something more persistent. Dragons had thrived for thousands of years when subspace travel was rare, but in recent centuries traffic had increased exponentially as galactic civilization expanded. The elves had been using the same hyperspace routes for generations, and those routes passed directly through their home systems. This meant their worlds were being constantly bombarded with subspace radiation that accumulated over time. The solution was not simple because you could not just stop all hyperspace travel. But the research suggested that establishing settlements near human populations could protect dragons until a better solution was found. Claire proposed creating a series of mixed settlements where humans and elves lived together in permanent communities. The idea faced resistance from both sides because neither species was accustomed to sharing living space so intimately. But the alternative was watching dragons die, and that was unacceptable to everyone. Lyra found herself becoming an unofficial ambassador between the two species. She explained elven customs to curious humans and helped other elves understand human directness and informal social structures. The cultural differences were significant but not insurmountable. Elves valued grace and tradition, while humans prized efficiency and innovation. Elves made decisions slowly through consensus, while humans often acted quickly based on individual initiative. But both species valued loyalty and both cared deeply about protecting those who depended on them. Lyra watched the copper dragon soar across the common area in graceful loops and felt her heart swell with gratitude. The dragon had grown strong and confident, and its scales gleamed like polished metal in the afternoon sun. Katie stood below, tracking its flight and calling encouragement. The dragon dove playfully and buzzed past her head before climbing. Again, Lyra realized that she had not thought about Ember's loss in several days. The pain was still there, but it had become something she could carry without being crushed by its weight. She had found a new purpose in this strange human settlement, and maybe even the beginning of a new home. The copper dragon landed on her shoulder and nuzzled her cheek with obvious affection. It had bonded with Katie, but it still remembered who had carried it through the darkest days. Lyra stroked its scales and whispered thanks in the old language. The dragon chirped a reply and spread its wings to catch the sunlight. That moment, Lyra understood something important. Humans had not just saved 3. The settlement changed in ways nobody could have predicted as more elves and dragons arrived seeking sanctuary. Within 3 months, the population had tripled, and the simple colonial outpost had transformed into something that resembled a proper city. Humans and elves worked side by side, building new structures that combined both architectural styles. The results were sometimes awkward, but always interesting. Lyra stood on a new observation platform that looked out over the expanded settlement and tried to process how much had changed. Below her, humans and elves moved through shared spaces with growing comfort. Children of both species played together in designated areas, while dragons swooped overhead in elaborate flight patterns. The copper dragon had grown significantly and now measured nearly 2 meters from nose to tail. Katie still spent hours with it every day and had become something of an expert in dragon behavior and training. She had written a guide for other humans who wanted to work with dragons, and the document had become essential reading. The silver dragon had developed an unexpected talent for detecting mechanical problems before they became serious. Ben swore that it could sense stress fractures and energy fluctuations that instruments missed. He had started bringing it to inspect critical systems, and twice the dragon had alerted him to failures that would have caused major damage. The green dragon had become a fixture in the medical facility, and patients actually requested its presence during treatments. Lisa documented several cases where recovery times improved when the dragon was in the room. She theorized that the same stabilizing effect that helped dragons might also benefit other species in subtle ways. Lyra's role had expanded far beyond what she initially expected. She now coordinated between the Elven Council and the Human Administration, and helped resolve the countless small conflicts that arose from 2 species. Learning to coexist. Some problems were practical, like disagreements over resource allocation and building priorities. Others were cultural, like misunderstandings about personal space and communication styles. Elves found human directness jarring, while humans often felt that elven politeness was unnecessarily complicated, but both sides were learning to adapt and find middle ground. Rachel's research team had made significant progress in understanding the subspace radiation phenomenon. They confirmed that the radiation was strongest along major hyperspace routes and accumulated over time near frequently used jump points. Dragon biology was uniquely vulnerable because of how they processed energy for flight and fire breathing. The radiation disrupted the quantum entanglement that allowed dragons to convert matter into plasma. Without that ability, dragons could not regulate their body temperature or digest food properly. Human bioelectric fields somehow restored the entanglement and allowed normal function to resume. The team was working on technological solutions that might replicate the human effect. If they succeeded, it would mean dragons could survive anywhere without needing constant human proximity. But the technology was years away from being practical. In the meantime, the only viable solution was keeping dragons near human populations. This reality had sparked intense debate in the Elven Council. Some members argued for maintaining traditional independence and limiting contact with humans. Others insisted that survival required adaptation and embracing new partnerships. The debate had grown heated enough that the council split into factions. Lyra found herself caught in the middle because both sides wanted her support. The traditionalists pointed out that elves had maintained their culture for thousands of years without human help. The progressives argued that circumstances had changed and clinging to tradition meant watching dragons die. Lyra understood both perspectives, but her own position was clear. She had watched 17 dragons vanish and held 3 dying babies in her arms. She would do whatever was necessary to prevent more deaths, even if it meant changing everything about elven society. Claire called Lyra to her office one morning with news that would force the issue. A large elven ship had entered the system, carrying over 300 refugees and more than 50 dragons. Most of the dragons were juveniles or hatchlings, and many were already showing signs of energy depletion. The ship's captain was requesting immediate landing clearance in Sanctuary. Claire asked Lyra whether the settlement could handle such a large influx. The honest answer was that they were already stretched thin and this would push resources to the breaking point, but turning them away meant condemning dragons to death. Lyra told Claire they had no choice but to accept them and figure out the logistics. Somehow, Claire nodded and said she had expected that answer. She had already started organizing the settlement for emergency expansion. Within hours, the entire community mobilized for the largest cooperative effort they had attempted. Humans and elves worked through the night constructing temporary shelters and setting up distribution centers for supplies. Katie organized teams of volunteers to provide immediate care for the arriving dragons. Ben's workshops went into overdrive, producing equipment needed for the expanded population. Lisa transformed the medical facility into a triage center and trained dozens of new assistants. The elven ship landed at dawn, and the sight of so many refugees emerging was both heartbreaking and inspiring. Families carried sick dragons and pulled carts loaded with whatever possessions they had managed to bring. Children clung to their parents and looked around with wide, frightened eyes. Lyra stood with Claire at the landing area and helped organize the arrivals into groups. Each dragon was assessed and matched with a human volunteer who would provide stabilizing contact. The system worked, but barely, because there were not enough volunteers for all the dragons who needed help. Katie solved the problem by suggesting that each human could work with multiple dragons in shifts. Dragons did not need constant contact, but rather regular exposure several times per day. By rotating through groups, one human could help stabilize 4 or 5 dragons. The solution was not perfect, but it kept everyone alive while they figured out better arrangements. Among the refugees was an elven elder named Theron, who had served on the council for over 2 centuries. He was tall even by elven standards, with silver hair and eyes that held deep wisdom and deeper sadness. Theron sought out Lyra on the second day after the ship landed. He wanted to see firsthand what she had built and understand how the human partnership actually worked. Lyra took him on a tour of the settlement and showed him everything, without hiding the difficulties or the conflicts. She introduced him to Claire, and they discussed the administrative challenges of managing a mixed population. She brought him to Katie's training sessions, where humans learn to work with dragons. She showed him Ben's workshops where elven and human engineers collaborated on new designs. She walked him through Lisa's medical facility, where species barriers dissolved in the face of shared purpose. Theron observed everything carefully and asked thoughtful questions. At the end of the tour, he stood on the observation platform and watched. The sun set over the ocean dragons flew in formation against the orange sky, while below them humans and elves shared an evening meal in the common area. Theron was quiet for a long time before finally speaking. He told Lyra that what she had created here was both beautiful and terrifying. It was beautiful because it showed what was possible when species chose cooperation over isolation. It was terrifying because it meant the end of the world as elves had known it for millennia. Everything was changing and there was no going back. Lyra asked if he thought that was a bad thing. Theron smiled sadly and said he did not know. Change was always frightening, especially to those who had lived long enough to see patterns repeat, but he admitted that the alternative was worse. He had watched dragons die on the elven homeworlds and felt helpless to prevent it. Here at least there was hope. He told Lyra that he would return to the council and argue for official partnership with human settlements. It would not be an easy fight because many elders feared losing their cultural identity. But Theron believed the evidence was undeniable. Dragons thrived near humans, and that single fact outweighed all philosophical arguments. Lyra felt something shift in her chest as she listened. For months she had been fighting this battle mostly alone and wondering if she was making the right choices. Having Theron's support meant that change was actually possible on a larger scale. That night the copper dragon sought her out and curled up beside her while she tried to sleep. The dragon had grown large enough that it barely fit on the sleeping platform, but it still wanted physical closeness the way it had when it was small and dying. Lyra stroked its scales and thought about everything that had led to this moment. She had lost Ember and 17 other dragons, and watched her world become poisonous to the creatures she loved most. She had made a desperate journey to an unknown planet and trusted aliens she had never met. She had helped build something new from the ashes of what was lost. The copper dragon rumbled contentedly, and its warmth seeped into her bones. Outside her window, she could hear the sounds of the settlement settling down for the night. Human voices mixed with elven songs, and somewhere a dragon called to its mates. It was messy and chaotic, and nothing like the ordered beauty of traditional elven society. But it was alive and real, and full of possibility. Lyra closed her eyes and let herself imagine a future where this was normal, where humans and elves and dragons lived together, not because circumstances forced them, but 6 months after the first refugees arrived, the settlement had become something that neither humans nor elves could have imagined on their own. The population had grown to nearly 2,000 individuals, split almost evenly between both species. Over 200 dragons called the place home, and their presence changed everything about daily life. Lyra walked through the central market district where vendors from both species sold goods side by side. An elven craftsman displayed intricate jewelry, next to a human merchant offering practical tools. A mixed group of children ran past chasing a young dragon who was clearly enjoying the game. The dragon's caretaker was a human teenager named Amy, who had discovered an unexpected talent for working with the creatures. She had started a program teaching other young people from both species how to bond with dragons properly. The program had become so successful that there was now a waiting list of families hoping to partner with dragons. Katie had been promoted to head of the Dragon Care Division, and she coordinated dozens of volunteers who ensured every dragon received adequate human contact. The copper dragon stayed with her constantly and had become something of a mascot for the entire settlement. It performed aerial displays during community gatherings, and children loved watching it practice complex flight maneuvers. The silver dragon had never left Ben's side, and the two had developed an almost telepathic understanding. Ben claimed the dragon could predict equipment failures hours before any instrument detected problems. Other engineers had started requesting dragon assistance after seeing how effective the partnership was. The green dragon had taken to medical work with such enthusiasm that Lisa was training it to assist in actual procedures. The dragon could fetch specific instruments and even seemed to understand when patients needed comfort. Lisa had documented over 50 cases where patient outcomes improved with Dragon Presence. Rachel's research team had finally achieved a breakthrough in replicating the human stabilizing effect. They developed a device that generated bioelectric fields, similar to those produced by human bodies. The technology was still experimental, but early tests showed promising results. If it worked, it could eventually allow dragons to survive anywhere without requiring constant proximity to humans. But even if the technology succeeded, nobody expected dragons and elves to abandon the mixed settlements. Something deeper had developed here beyond simple survival necessity. Theron had returned to the Elven Council and spent weeks arguing for official recognition of the human partnership. The debate had been fierce, with traditionalists resisting every proposal, but Theron brought evidence that could not be denied. He showed recordings of thriving dragons and data about improved health outcomes. He presented testimonials from elven families who had rebuilt their lives in the mixed settlements, argued that cooperation did not mean losing elven identity, but rather expanding what it meant to be elven. The vote was close, but ultimately the progressives won. The council officially recognized the human settlements as sanctuaries and pledged resources to support their expansion. More importantly, they agreed to establish new mixed colonies on other worlds. The decision sent shockwaves through elven society and triggered passionate responses from all sides. But for Lyra, and those living in the settlements, it simply confirmed what they already knew. The future belonged to those willing to adapt and grow. Claire called a settlement-wide assembly to announce the council's decision and discuss what it meant. Nearly everyone attended because this moment represented validation for everything they had built together. Claire stood on a raised platform with Lyra beside her and addressed the crowd in both languages. She spoke about the journey from desperate refuge to thriving community. She acknowledged the challenges and conflicts that had tested everyone's patience and commitment, but she also celebrated the successes and the friendships that had formed across species lines. Then Claire announced her own decision. The settlement was officially changing its name from Haven's Edge to something that better reflected its dual nature. From now on, it would be called Dragon's Rest in the common tongue and Starhome in the Elven language. Both names would be used equally because both species had equal claim to this place. The crowd erupted in cheers, and Lyra felt tears sliding down her face for the second time since arriving. Here Katie appeared beside her with the copper dragon on her shoulders and pulled Lyra into a tight hug. The dragon chirped happily and spread its wings to include both of them in the embrace. Ben joined them with the silver dragon following close behind. Lisa came over with the green dragon perched on her arm. They stood together as a strange mixed family. That would have been impossible just months ago. Theron found Lyra later that evening when the celebration had settled into quieter gatherings. He told her that the council wanted her to serve as official liaison between human and elven interests. The position came with authority and resources to help establish new settlements on other worlds. Lyra asked if she had to leave Dragon's Rest to accept the role. Theron smiled and said no, because this place would always be the model that others followed. Her presence here was more valuable than anything she could do elsewhere. But she would travel occasionally to advise new settlements and help them avoid the mistakes that had been made here. Lyra accepted because she understood the importance of spreading what they had learned. The next morning, she stood at the observation platform one more time, looking out over everything that had been built. The settlement stretched along the coast in a mix of architectural styles that somehow worked together. Dragons filled the sky in numbers that would have seemed impossible when she first landed with 3 dying babies. Humans and elves moved through shared spaces with the easy familiarity of neighbors who had learned to appreciate their differences. Katie was leading a training session in the open area below, and a dozen young people from both species watched intently as she demonstrated proper dragon care techniques. Ben was visible in his workshop, surrounded by elven and human engineers who debated designs with passionate intensity. Lisa stood outside the medical facility talking with an elven healer and comparing notes on treatment protocols. The copper dragon suddenly appeared beside Lyra, having launched itself from wherever it had been resting. It was fully grown now, with scales that gleamed like polished bronze and wings that spanned nearly 4 meters. The dragon settled onto the platform railing and gazed out over the settlement with what looked like satisfaction. Lyra reached out and stroked, its neck remembering the tiny, weak creature that had clung to her during that desperate journey. The dragon rumbled deep in its chest and turned to look at her with eyes that held intelligence and gratitude. In that moment, Lyra felt the bond between them stronger than ever before. Not just the bond between her and this specific dragon, but the larger connection that had formed between species. They had come together out of desperation and necessity, but had created something that transcended survival. They had built community and friendship and hope. The copper dragon launched itself from the railing and climbed into the sky with powerful wing beats. It circled once and called out a challenge that was answered by dozens of other dragons across the settlement. They rose together in a spiral of color and grace and performed a flight pattern that was part dance and part celebration. Humans and elves stopped what they were doing to watch. Children pointed and laughed while adults smiled at the display. For a few perfect moments, everyone was united in simple appreciation of beauty. Katie appeared beside Lyra and slipped her hand into the elf's without saying anything. They stood together watching the dragons paint patterns across the sky. Ben and Lisa joined them. And then Theron and Claire, more humans and elves, gathered on the platform until it was crowded with people from both species. Nobody spoke because words felt unnecessary. The dragons understood what they were doing and began to form specific shapes in the air. They created a double helix that represented the intertwining of two peoples. Then they broke apart and reformed into a circle that had no beginning or end. Finally, they scattered, and each dragon returned to its bonded human. The copper dragon landed beside Lyra and Katie with precise grace. It folded its wings and made a sound that was pure contentment. Katie laughed and hugged the dragon's neck while Lyra rested her hand on its shoulder. Claire cleared her throat and spoke quietly, said this was exactly what she had hoped would happen when the council first voted to accept refugees. Not just survival, but genuine integration and mutual enrichment. Theron agreed and added that he had lived for over 2 centuries and never seen anything quite like what existed here. He said the elven people had a saying about how true change required courage to release the past and embrace the unknown. This settlement embodied that principle better than anything in elven history. Lyra looked at the faces around her and saw humans and elves standing shoulder to shoulder. She saw dragons resting comfortably among people who had learned to appreciate them. She saw children playing games that mixed traditions from both cultures. She thought about Ember and the 17 dragons who had vanished and all the pain that had brought her to this place. That pain would never fully disappear because loss left permanent marks, but it had been transformed into something meaningful,